teacher, if you want to work at the building level as a secretary, or if you want a central office position, it is a
Okay, Ryan, I'm ready to start.
Okay, this is it right here.
Your sweater looks
Okay, we're live.
good. Evening, everyone. I am calling our meeting this evening to order. Please call the roll.
Ms. Adair,
Present.
Mr. Cole,
I'm here.
Ms. Ingles,
Present.
Ms. Price,
Present.
Ms. Upchurch,
Present.
Ms. Burrell.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you so much. So just this evening, we are not actually live. We are recording today. We have some internet issues. So those of you who tried to tune in live, we're sorry. Hopefully we'll get that recording out to you. We have a lot of great stuff to talk about tonight. All right, so first on our agenda is the approval of the October 9th, 2024 meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Your second?
Second.
Are there any changes or additions to the minutes? Seeing none, without objection, the minutes are approved. Okay, so looking at the rest of the agenda, actually need to approve the whole agenda, sorry. So we are going to be doing a tour of this complex based on task force recommendation. We are then going to come back and debrief and hear from our treasurer to understand more about the value and cost associated with the complex. And we are going to be taking no action tonight on that. This is just a lot of information gathering. It's our next meeting that we will then think about it and make a recommendation to the board. So tonight is just a lot of information gathering. Item 3.3, we're going to be hearing from our COO to start to understand the cost of transportation in our transportation structure. We're going to hear a kind of a quick ESSER wrap up and levy promise update from Catherine Moser. We are going to review our new cash balance policy, which our treasurer will help us walk through. And then we're going to learn about the establishment of the resource planning team, which was on our agenda last meeting, and we're going to have to untable it because we tabled it. So that is our agenda this evening. Can I have a motion to approve our agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Our agenda has now been approved. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to go on the tour. I believe Alex Trevino will be leading us in that tour. Because we're going to be going into closed spaces, we're going to have our security team also walk with us, and the tour is going to be for our staff and the committee members because we are going to be going into some closed, secure places in this building and the complex. We anticipate the tour taking about 30 minutes or so, and we will come back here and start to record again. So the recording will be paused. We are still in a public meeting, however, as we are walking around. And we will come back and do a debrief and then talk with our treasurer. So we're going to go ahead and pause the recording, and then I'm just going to have Alex kind of come up and maybe tell us, or maybe pause after Alex talks, but tell us what we're doing, and then we'll go on our tour.
Yep, so if you're not all aware, so what we call 270 East State Street campus is actually 3 buildings. So there's this building at 270 East State Street. There is the 5th Street Annex, which is just to the north of us, and then the 6th Street Annex, which is just to the north and the east of us. So we will meet, we'll kind of do meet point right at the outside entrance to this facility, and then from there we'll walk over to the 6th Street Annex. It's 2 floors there. We'll walk through both floors quickly. Then we'll come back across the parking lot. We'll hit the 5th Street Annex. It is also 2 stories, but I'll warn you, unless anybody really feels like they need to see the 2nd story, we'll probably do the first main level only. The stairs are a little narrow and winding. And then we'll come back and we'll hit this building. We'll take the elevator up to the 3rd floor and kind of work our way down. If anybody does want or need the elevator, it is obviously right outside. And again, we'll meet right outside the front entry and get started.
All right, thank you, Alex. So we're going to go ahead now and pause the recording, and if everyone could join us at the front of 270, we will start the tour with Alex.
every day. We have dedicated teachers, some of whom have worked with students here for more than 50 years. A passion for helping students that can be felt throughout the district and community. This is Columbus City Schools.
Okay, we are back from our tour. I'll have Alex kind of maybe just do a quick summation again about where we just went, and then I'll open the floor to members of the committee. If they have any questions or comments, just based on what you saw, what you experienced, maybe some things that were surprising to you. And then we'll move into a conversation with our treasurer, and we'll move right into item 3.2. Turn it back over to Alex.
Great, thank you, Ms. Adair. So just in summary, so we walked the campus here, which incorporates almost the full city block, minus the church property that sits at the corner. So we walked both floors of the 6th Street Annex, we moved to the 5th Street Annex, and then we wrapped up here at the 270 East State Street facility, looking at all 4 floors, and just kind of noting the difference and the conditions with some focus on the restrooms and then the office layouts and recent improvements.
Thank you. Committee members, do you have any questions, reflections, comments, thoughts after spending about 50 minutes walking this property?
And please, feel free to speak openly.
Ms. President?
Were we going to go over the cost? You said something.
We're gonna do that after we do, let's just do our general reflections, and then I'm gonna have our treasurer actually walk through more of the numbers and the data, so you can kind of then, think about it. And again, just as a reminder, we are not making any decisions tonight. This is all just kind of taking in the information. We want to make sure you have time enough to think about this.
No clickers. You're on your own.
I think I would prefer to hear numbers and data before I ask questions, so I can kind of put all of that together.
Okay.
I just want to note that some of our buildings are out of code. And I think and we have individuals working in them every day. And that's alarming to know. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
I would echo that. I was kind of taken aback by some of not in this building necessarily. This building seems to be in good condition and serviceable, but the 6th Street Annex had several places that just felt dangerous to even kind of navigate, much less have to go through every day. Also, the 5th Street building kind of confused me because I hear us saying that it is used for storage. There does not seem to be any rhyme or reason. It seems more like a dumping ground of things that are excess that we're not quite sure because there doesn't really seem to be a lot of, there's no organization, or maybe there is, and it's just not apparent to anybody that's not organizing it, but it seems like the things that are being stored there are not well taken care of or looked after or maybe even remembered.
Okay. Alex, any last thing? We really appreciate you walking us through and sharing the information about buildings, and those of you that also jumped in on the tours, sharing bits of information about the history of this building, including when pieces of the buildings have been updated or renovated. So thank you all. So I'll turn it over now to Treasurer Cook, who's going to go over the overview, more around the financial side of things, understanding what all of this is worth.
I don't have a clicker, so if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this first slide, and hopefully you have some of this in front of you, our utility costs for 2023 were $79,000 for this campus. 2024 was $86,000, just to give you an idea of what it takes to heat, cool, electrify, et cetera, for this facility here. I think with the next slide, we'll start to get into the meat and potatoes of what everybody's concerned about talking about. So if we can go to the next slide. Capital investment to the appraisal. So a lot of questions on what is this facility worth? We had it appraised. We received that approximately about a month ago, and the appraisal is $7.2 million is what this property is estimated to be worth today if we were to sell it. That's based on a market appraisal, commercial real estate here in Columbus, Ohio. If we put a for sale sign out today, what do we think we can get for it based on market analysis? And that figure is $7.2 million. What's interesting is we toured it tonight, a lot of comments on things run down, broken, not ADA compliant. I'll note there's no fire suppression system, there's no fire alarm system. We have an estimate for capital improvements that are needed to this building, $11.4 million. That fire suppression system and alarm system is not included in that estimate. $8 million of that figure is deferred maintenance, items that should have been repaired. Yes, go ahead.
When you say this building, you mean all three buildings or specifically the one that we're sitting in now?
The appraisals for the entire campus that we spoke of, primarily the estimate for repairs is for this facility itself right here. Deferred maintenance, very common in school districts, but you get behind the 8 ball, and then there's this avalanche of trying to catch up over the years. And then you get the inflationary pressure, costs continue to rise, and it's very difficult for districts to get out from under that. So $11.4 million in capital improvements to this facility that we know we need today. Things like ADA restrooms, we've talked about spacing on our floor. I've broken those out so that you can see where that 11.4 came from. $1.4 million for just the restrooms, $2 million for us with that third floor vault, just so we can have more team members there so we can adequately staff, be more effective and efficient in our processing. $2 million to remove that big square area. The rest of that 11.4 is deferred maintenance, $8 million. And we actually have estimates on that. We've not made those figures up. Those are verifiable and legit numbers. So we can go to the next slide.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have estimates on tear down?
I do not. I have not gotten to that point because no decisions have been made. Right now, I'm just looking at kind of the here and now and the present.
Okay.
Should anything happen with that, I'm sure there will be other teams that will take a look at that, but I do not have that now. So in terms of school, commercial real estate, a lot of us that work in the industry were familiar with OFCC in the past, the Ohio School Facilities Commission, as I still like to call it. It used to be, if it was 2/3 of the cost to replace, they said tear it down. It's just not cost effective to move forward with. There's a ton of metrics out there in the commercial real estate market. The one that I felt most closely aligned with that was what they call after repair value. You take the appraisal, and then 70% of that appraisal, you could plug in 100%, and we're still upside down on this thing.
Yeah, we are.
It's that 70% rule. So you take the appraisal minus the repairs, and it's 70%. We're $6 million upside down. Even if we said, okay, great, we'll get 100% after that, we're still $4 million upside down. I joked with some folks outside as we toured this. Most of us have seen the movie The Money Pit. This is really a money pit. There's a lot of capital investment that needs to be put into this facility, and at least in my mind fiscally, those are dollars that, as we talk about some of these other items, can be reallocated into the classroom. It's really what we're here for. We're not here to operate and repair this specific piece of real estate. So I would just, you make decisions in the future, think about where we're at today, what the capital investment is to get this facility up to snuff, those deferred maintenance costs. And again, there's other items we don't know about. Mr. O'Connor and I were talking about the growth that's around this facility, the trucks that are up and down the road. You know, Grandview's dealing with some of those issues now. There's wear and tear on sewer systems. What are we going to do when sewer lines begin to collapse, when it trickles over into the parking lot? Even if we decided to sell this or do whatever down the road, we still have to fix that before we can recognize any gain. We're not going to be able to sell it.
To your knowledge, are there other existing buildings that the school district owns that could accommodate the functions, the people who work here, the functions that are operating out of these buildings?
I can speak for my team. I would say no, not designed to be functional, correct? Not at all.
Can our chief of staff come up and maybe from the superintendent's side speak to that a little bit? Because these are conversations that the team has been having about how we work as adults in this district and aligning and the kind of space we need.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Mike DeFabo, I'm the Chief of Staff for the school district. Yeah, I think this is a great question. A lot of large urban school districts do this work a different way. Many of them will take a high school, renovate the high school into office space. we have a lot of space, and we have a lot of options for what we would do with that space. And so, as we also saw, we have a lot of online work happening out of these buildings. And so, one of the things that Alex has been preaching about for years with the district is that we don't have a space utilization standard for office space. So an office for one person looks very different from an office for the next person. And that creates a whole host of issues, as you can imagine, because we will have folks packed in like sardines, or we will have folks in very large spaces, and we're all kind of scratching our heads around that. So part of the work that I know Alex has talked about for a very long time, and I know he has talked about with our new Chief Operating Officer, Maurice Woods, is that we need to also talk about what space standardization looks like. It will be very difficult to have conversations about what we should be moving into without knowing what we should be moving into. And so I think that's something that we really need to prioritize.
Can you maybe talk, sorry, maybe I wasn't clear.
Yep.
Can you just speak a little like more high level about the philosophy around how adults should work? Because right now we're very all over the place in our administration, and she was speaking about, you know, how do facilities work, just like we're having that exercise with our schools right now. We really need to kind of realign things so that our adults can work better.
Yeah, this is,
We're not to that point, so.
Yes,
yeah.
The superintendent and I, before the superintendent was the superintendent, she was the chief of transformation and leadership, I was the chief talent officer. All day, every day, we walked out of our offices and worked together on issues across the organization. Our central office is all over the place. We wouldn't even be in this room or in this building if we were in those roles still. And so our ability to interact with each other is reliant on either lots of travel or lots of Zoom or lots of phone calls, which we're always going to have those things, but our ability to brainstorm and problem solve is very difficult. We're certainly not doing that organically, because we're not running into each other in the hall. And so it's all planned time. It's all planned exercise. It certainly does not support relationship building. And so we have a chief of IT who is located at one building. We have a chief of student supports who is located in another building. We have multiple chiefs at 3700. We also have chiefs in this building. And those chiefs and the board direct reports run departments and have teams. Those teams are not organically interacting because of how this is set up. And so because there is no shared space, and we are literally all across the city, then the time we are together becomes very purposeful, but it is not, it does not lead to organic problem solving, which is certainly what you would expect in an organization our size.
Great.
Do we have any information, and it's perfectly fine if you don't, but do we have any information about the cost of that? The cost of what you just said, the cost of the inefficiency? And it may not be a dollar amount, but
yeah, so I can tell you from my view, which is pretty global across the organization, I see a lot of siloing of departments. I see a lot of advocacy of spaces instead of advocacy of programs. And so, like we saw in this building, there's some very beautiful spaces in this building, and there's some spaces that are not. It's less about function and student support needs, et cetera. It becomes about who advocates the best, basically, or at least that's what it's been in the past. Thankfully, we'll be talking a little bit about the resource planning team in a little bit, so we're trying to address that. But for me, the biggest issue and hurdle, based on your question, is really the joint problem solving is critical to any large business, really any business, but any large business, and we are not set up for that. And so we have to create intentional spaces for that, which is fine, but it is not conducive to teamwork. It's conducive to siloing.
Okay, I had a question as well. So the planning of central enrollment, what was the district thinking? That seems to be a functional entity over in central enrollment.
Yes.
What kind of planning went into that?
I don't have that information, but maybe Alex does.
Well, I think we'll put a pin in that,
Okay.
because that's not essential to the question at hand, but I do think it's essential to, as we continue discussing what our chief of staff just said, and thinking about this space, both in terms of functionality and investment for our district, as we continue to looking at all of our spaces and understanding how are we doing this across the board, because this is not our only admin site. So I think that that's a fair kind of question, just I'm gonna put a pin in it for later.
And I would share that the superintendent certainly would like everyone to be in one space. That is her goal. She does believe in that teamwork and collaboration across all teams, and so that would be her goal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, just a reminder, I know that we get really excited because we want to think about what can be, but we got to do it in baby steps first, right? So the first step of this, really our question, is thinking about the asset of this building, the land that we are sitting on, and saying, should we be spending money to continue to invest in it, upkeep, maintenance, make improvements, or should we not? And then kind of the future questions about if the answer is no, then that's the kind of the next process that goes forward. So this committee is just being asked that first recommendation to the board. Right now, looking at what is here, is this a sound investment as it is currently situated for our district? And so that's why we took you on the tours, we had the appraisals, but we have, lots of either way, all the ways, ideas going forward that will be the next step. So just to kind of level set, we kind of got to do this in stages. Okay? All right, if you do have additional questions, because again, we're not going to be voting on it tonight, so I really do want you to think through. If there's additional information you want, if you want to come back and look at something again in the daylight, just let us know and we can make that happen. But we'll be putting forward in our next meeting for us to have more discussion about what we would recommend to the Board of Education about continuing to invest in this property and asset as it currently sits. Okay, so that will be the question that we will be addressing. Board members, is there anything you would like to add or any comments? I know that we kind of allowed our community members to really get the full feel of it, but before we move on.
So I'm sorry, I want to make sure I'm clear. The intentions right now, the intention is not to ask the questions based on, because I feel that I'm going to ask questions based on the alternative to keeping this building. But I have to ask those questions. I can't just say no when I don't know what I'm getting into on the other side.
I think the questions are fair. I guess what I'm saying is this committee will not be making a recommendation yet towards that. And part of that is because we don't know, it might include other committees, right? And so our first question is just to tell the board, do we think that this asset is something we should continue to invest in? And then there'll be a secondary question of, if it is not, then what?
So in order to determine that, you need to know what the other alternative is.
Yeah,
That's my thought
You
process.
can totally ask. No, you can totally ask if you want. Like, what I'm saying is we are not, we're still in the process of looking at all the different options, and so we can definitely talk about that. I guess what I'm saying is, when we go to do a vote, that is not the vote that we're gonna be taking.
Yes.
We're not making yet the recommendation about the future state.
Okay.
Do you have a question?
If I can add to that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Because I think it's important to add to that. When the opportunity comes for us to present other viable options to this space, that conversation will be had. So I want to put it in as close to that as you're looking to get.
I mean, really, it's not, okay, the options are we sell, or the options are we maintain the property and reinvest in it. And what that can look like, it could be a multitude of things. It probably means we are not keeping any of these buildings if we take that path, right? And so what would we redevelop this property into to meet the needs of our district and our community? And so that probably, in order to be done, would have to be some sort of public-private partnership that we would enter into. And that's, we see that all around. And so we're not there yet, but that'll be kind of the decisions. Do we want to take that path? We think we need it for our district. It's something like, there's so many things that could happen on this property. Or are we just like, we should sell and let somebody else redevelop it? So that's really going to be the future question. Unless you guys are like, these buildings are amazing, and we think that you should just keep paying, right? And so really that's where we are. Okay, but those conversations will be had. Like, that will still have community engagement. We're still going to talk through that, but it's just a step-by-step process. Because if we do say, no, we do not want to invest in these buildings any longer, even any longer, that means that we can begin to transition people out of these spaces into other spaces, bring these buildings down, so that we are not continuing to spend the money in the maintenance and upkeep of these buildings while then we decide the future use or sale.
Sure. But I get what Keisha's saying. It's difficult to think about a recommendation around that if you don't know what the cost, if we only know what the cost of half of the problem is.
Yeah, well, we can get that, so.
Yeah, we'll have that. We'll have a plan, and we'll be able to lay out that it's much more cost-effective if the committee determines to go that route. We'll have that for you.
Thank you.
So that's something we can have for the next meeting.
Right, and it's not an attempt to be clandestine.
Sure.
I want you to understand that. It's not an attempt to be clandestine. I think certain things are in process, need to be figured out, more thought through. And then once that happens, that conversation is then presented to us in a way that I think is thorough, in a way that I think is efficient, in a way that helps us distill exactly where it is that we're trying to be at the end of the day. So please understand, it's not an opportunity to be intransparent.
I'll be able to answer that
or
question for you.
clandestine, yeah.
And if you honestly feel like you need more time or more information, we can vote the next meeting. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah.
Thank you.
But send concerns in the intermediate time. Please, feel free to send concerns and
Ingalls?
thoughts.
Yeah, good job.
I just want to share a general reflection that obviously some of the properties, all of the properties, I would say, that we went through, or all of the buildings, I should say, that we went through today have significant problems. And, we're going to be evaluating the cost of that. But there is some real opportunity with this space, and so we know that, and that's something that I'm really interested in digging into, because this is our centrally located space in the district. We have here, we have up on 17th, we have a few other places, and 3700, which is at the southmost part of this entire district. And so when we're thinking about these things, 270 being downtown is potentially an asset and something that we would want to consider in how we would develop this space and what we would contribute and what we would house here. And as our city continues to grow and expand and density grows, and that means traffic is heavier and it's harder and harder to find downtown space, if that world comes to Columbus, I think that there's real opportunity here, and I'm certainly not interested in just saying, okay, let's wash our hands, keep going, because I think that there's a combination of what can we solve today and what fiscally responsible decisions can we make today, but also how are we building for our future, and the future that is not only the technological advances that our students and our staff need, but the proximity that they need.
Keisha, if I could, just so you know, there will be a plan that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We will close all of those loops for you.
All right, again, if you have additional questions, needs, let me know, I'll let Carl know, and we'll make sure that those are answered in our next discussion. So thank you, everyone who was involved in that today and the tours. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next agenda item, which is 3.3. We're going to be talking with our COO around transportation. Before we get started, I just want to remind the committee members that the presentation and discussion surrounding this topic you will hear tonight will be limited to discussing the shortage of bus drivers and the need to look differently at how we transport students, including cost. As many of you know, we do have pending litigation regarding the district's transportation of non-public school students. Please be reminded that that is not the issue that we are talking about today in this conversation. And so we are going to, and I will remind you if we feel like we have a question. Again, it's not that we don't want to answer them. It is just not an appropriate question for this particular presentation. So I will turn it over to COO, Mr. Woods.
So good evening, everyone. Chair Adair, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. I want to start by really just acknowledging the transportation team for the work that they've been doing. My counterpart, Rodney Stuffle, being the Executive Director of Transportation, could not be here today. He's under the weather. But I just want to acknowledge him, and one of our leaders in the department, Tim Hutchinson, is here joining me in the audience. I want to just thank you all publicly for the work that you've done over the years, and especially this last year. So what I want to do is I want to take, next slide, please. Next two slides. I want to take about 10, 12 minutes to take you all on a journey. We're talking about transportation, so I want to take you on a short journey. We're going to talk a little bit about the past, the present, and the future. This is a conversation that has to involve kind of our cost structure, so we'll spend a little time looking at our financials. We'll park a little bit on what I call cost structure misalignment and realignment. We will look at kind of where we sit versus national and state peer transportation departments from a benchmarking perspective. Then we'll shift to talking about the present, what has transpired just recently over the last 3 to 6 months. I think there's some kudos and some well dones that need to be acknowledged for the team, the opening of this school year. And then we'll close talking about the future. We don't have any strong recommendations today, but there are some topics that we just want to put on the table for consideration. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I want to start by just talking about the complexities of our transportation department. As you can see on the slide in front of you, we're about a $75 million department. It's a department that has approximately 5, I call them terminals, we call them centers here, but we have approximately 5 transportation centers in which routes are started at those different centers across the city here. We have approximately 473 routes. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. And our bus fleet is probably twice the amount of routes that we have. So we have about 843 buses in our fleet. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but I think that it's important that we talk about our cost structure. So I'll try to have you focus or point you to the lines that I want you to focus on as I tell this story. I want to start with the second row, which is the state reimbursements at the top of this slide. As you can see, the reimbursements, sometimes called revenues in normal income statements, has been approximately $29 million for the last 3 years, relatively flat. I want you to drop down to the bottom of this slide, the yellow highlighted row, and these are basically our expenses. This is the cost it takes for us to run the district. A couple things I want you to highlight. First of all, as you go from left to right, you will see that there's been a significant increase in our expenses over the last few years. I'll highlight the drivers of that. But I also want you to note the gap between the reimbursement that we receive and the expenses that it takes to run the district. Those are funded through our general fund. So any funds out of the general funds are funds that could potentially be used to move student achievement, to move student academics in the classroom, et cetera. So we're making a big investment in our transportation model in its current state. The drivers of the increase, or the drivers of our expenses, are twofold. One, if you look at our salaries over the last year, we have increased some salaries. I'll go into a little bit more detail there, but at a very high level, we've invested in more drivers, and we've invested in some positions that allow us to provide better customer service. That's an area of focus for us as we move forward. The larger driver is under purchase services. And in a nutshell, those are expenses that we use to partner with vendors to provide transportation services to some of our students, predominantly driven by our bus driver shortage. And as you can see, from 2022-23, we've increased significantly up to approximately $21 million for this current year. Go ahead.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that is?
Yeah, so in 2023, we had two vendors that provided transportation services to us. Vendors, they provide routing services, pick up our students, drop them off.
So these are bus drivers that are not employed by the district?
These are vendors that provide services, including buses and drivers that are not part of the district staff.
Okay.
Thank you for allowing me to clarify that. And part of the increase is, if you look at this year, we have 3 bus vendors, and we've also partnered with 2 additional van vendors. So we have 5 vendors this year versus 2 vendors a few years ago. Is there a question? Board Member Cole?
No, I just wanted to help you elaborate, but no, I think you answered the question.
You may get to this later, so if you're going to get to this, just say we'll get to this in a few minutes. But is there a reason that we know of that we can hire vendors but not, for whatever reason, be able to recruit and hire bus drivers directly?
I think it's a fair question. I think we're in an environment now where we have to look at all options to be able to provide services to the number of students that we provide. And we hire as many bus drivers as we can. Right. We had an all-hands-on-deck this summer. The team collaborated with HR, transportation. We did an amazing job hiring bus drivers this summer, and we were still short drivers. So in order to be able to provide the services to our students, we have to look outside of just that potential option.
And one more question, then I'll let you go back to your slides.
Your questions are fine.
How many bus drivers are we short? How many
Yeah.
how many vacancies do we have?
So hold that question.
Okay.
Well, you know what? Let me go. Can we go back a slide, please? I don't like to go back because then we don't get through, but we'll go back a slide. So right there, right there. So the total number of routes that we have are 473, right? If you add up all the routes from the different centers, that number does not equal 473. It's about 83 routes short.
Okay.
So right now, we use our vendors to cover those 83 routes that we can't cover.
And it costs that much more to do
It
that?
costs that much more, one, and two, because of supply and demand, the prices are escalating every day. So when we negotiate with vendors today, the cost that they're bringing to us is significantly different, and I don't want to say significantly higher, but it's significantly different than the prices that we were negotiating 2 years ago. And that's solely because of supply and demand.
In that supply and demand, let's be more succinct. Transportation costs with gas.
Right.
So any number of things that contribute to that make that cost contract and expand over time. So
just adding a
yes,
middleman.
at this point, it's an evolution process that we took to get here. So at one point in time, very quickly, we were at 700-something routes. We condensed that over time to a smaller route case, but also keep in mind, too, a part of that contraction and expansion is mobility issues with students. So 30% of our children have a mobility situation, unstable housing. So they may live on one part of town and may even be impractical for transportation, but then suddenly become practical for transportation because they live on another part of town that then has them closer or more distant from a school. So there's any number of variables that contribute to how we're doing this. The way we were able to try and manage it, to try and manage this hemorrhaging situation, was to condense the routes and then find additional vendors that can provide more support, particularly in those outer liar areas where we got to pick up kids, and it extends the route time on a bus from what at this point is just slightly under an hour to before that was a little longer than that.
That's correct. So that concludes my presentation.
My bad, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Can we click through the last slide?
Remember, Cole, and I have heard this presentation, because actually I should have said this first too. The academic committee has heard this as well, because this question around transportation is both an academic program, like how do we deliver our services, as well as a fiscal resource question. So we have heard this before. So we'll let
And experienced it as parents.
yes. So
in the
we'll let
district.
Mr. Woods continue.
So I'll go through it. I think it's worth repeating. And we really want to make sure that the committees, the public, the board, that everyone has a better understanding of the transportation model and some visibility into the model, because it's super complex. So I'll go through relatively quickly, but I think we hit on the high notes up to this point. Next slide, slide 7, please. So benchmarking against the national comparison districts, long story short, our costs are higher than the average of all districts nationally. We spend more on transportation than other districts across the nation. Next slide, please. What this basically says is we wanted to take a look at the Ohio districts and the ones that are specifically closer to our size. You'll see Cleveland and Akron. They have enrollments that's relatively close to ours. Some of the other districts, not as much. So when we go to the next slide and we look at Ohio as a state, 2 takeaways. One, we still spend more of a percentage of our operating budget on transportation than all of the other districts. If you narrow your focus to the left side of this slide, where Akron and Cleveland are, those are the districts that are close to our size. You can see we spend approximately double the amount of our operating budget on transportation versus some of the other larger districts in Ohio. Next slide, please. Similar story. The data has changed a little bit, but the takeaway is if you look at our enrollment versus the number of riders that are routed, we actually route and transport a larger percentage of the students that are enrolled.
And why is that, Mr. Woods, especially when we talk about high school?
Great question, right? So can you hold that question? We'll get to it. Next slide, please. So start to peel back the question that Chair Adair just asked. So I wanted to do a deeper dive into some benchmarks between Cleveland and Akron. If you look at miles per assigned bus, we're pretty much double the other large districts. A big portion of that has to do with some of our practices here in Columbus. For example, our school choice model. That puts us in a position where we're putting significantly more miles per year than some of the other districts that don't have that particular practice as part of their model. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about operational details. I think we've touched on this numerous times. Next slide. Number of bus drivers have gone down significantly. We've talked about that. Next slide, please. This is just an extension of that conversation. The takeaway here is twofold. If you look at the purple line that's relatively flat, that's the number of riders that we route every year. That has been relatively stable. The other thing to notice is that the number of charter schools that we've had from 1997 to today has increased significantly. So what that means is we're routing the same number of students, we have fewer drivers, fewer routes, but we have more locations that we're going to because of the charter schools. Therein lies some of the complexity of our existing model. Next slide, please. Just to touch on this really briefly, we do also, in addition to routing to school every day, we also support the district in other ways. This is just one example. We support our athletics program. We're proud to do that. Kudos to our football teams this year who made the playoffs. We were providing transportation on weekends, transportation late into the evenings to allow our athletes and our athletics to excel in the district.
Do the athletic programs or after-school programs contribute to the cost of running this transportation from their revenues?
Indirectly, not directly, but indirectly, we absorb it into that general fund budget that we talked about a little bit earlier. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm starting to wrap up. I do want to take a moment, next slide, to just highlight some of the continuous improvement efforts that the management team has put forth really over the last 2 years, but we started to see some of the results this last year. We've invested in routing software and tablets. We've invested in new vehicles to help us transport some of our students. Board Member Cole mentioned that we have special needs students that need transportation. We purchased about 30 vans this year, so that allows us to, to really provide services that are needed for the different populations that we serve. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are investments. I mentioned technology. We can continue. Next slide, please. We've made some staffing investments. The highlight here is we have brought on 20 new drivers, but I want to call out the second and the fourth bullet. We've invested in routers, and we've invested in our call center help, and we've seen a significant improvement in some of our customer service measures that we track and monitor, the amount of wait time that parents have when they call in, the number of times that, parents hang up because they've waited too long. We track that data, and we've seen a significant improvement in it because of this investment. Next slide. I mentioned alternative vehicles, purchased 30 new vans. Next slide, please. Path forward. Next slide. It's twofold. There are some short-term things that we can continue to focus on. We continue to build what I call the capability and the capacity of the organization. What I will tell you in visiting the terminals, the centers, there's a marked improvement in culture and morale, right? It's nice to see that. And we have made some investments into our staff and training and those types of things. So we will continue to stabilize the department. Longer term, we're developing a multi-year strategy. We're starting that work now. We hope to have it completed in the spring. And then the next slide, next two slides, if you can go to slide 25. One of the things that we have to think about as we think about the future, I talked a little bit about practices that we have in this district. There are some opportunities for us to maybe revisit some of those practices. These are some examples. I have them listed this way. It's not a priority list. It's more of an order of magnitude list. So as we go down the list, it becomes more complicated to do. However, the efficiencies and the cost savings tend to go up as we go down this list. So as we make considerations going forward, I just bring this to this group to introduce the conversation that these are things that, as we think about our 3-year strategy going forward, we may need to revisit to make our metrics and some of the key performance indicators that we track more in line with some of the other districts in the state of Ohio. I do have one correction that I need to make. I mentioned that athletics was absorbed in our general funds budget. It's my understanding that athletics does have a separate fund with a separate budget. So I just wanted to acknowledge that error, that misstatement.
I think it's important to also note that we do run one of the largest transportation operations in the country. And if you look at especially that slide that was showing our enrollment for the number of our enrollment and then the number of students that we are transporting in comparison to other Ohio schools, you see that our number is very large. And part of that is because of our own choice and how we do our enrollment. But another is because we are actually transporting more than our state minimum. So our state minimum says that we have to transport K through 8, and that was on another slide.
Slide 24, please.
And so we are choosing to transport our high school students. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and one of those is, and it was on the other slide, and I'm going back and forth, that we just were on with the dollar signs, is that we just really do not have a public transportation system in this city that supports that, and that's what the other cities are doing. Mm-hmm. They are putting their high school students on public transportation.
I cannot imagine putting my 14-year-old.
And so that's what everyone is doing. And so we are an outlier in that for that reason, but then also some of our own internal choices and policy on the way that we're doing enrollment. That's something our academic committee is looking at, is the program side, the why side. We, at the same time, have to look at it from this cost efficiency side, the resource side, the staffing side, and making sure that we are asking the right questions and looking into making recommendations alongside our academic vision to support that. And so this will not be the last time we talk about transportation. Today was kind of an overview, so you could start to get a feel for it, understand a little bit more about where the team is going. But this will be a process that we will be working with the academic committee on as well. Member Cole.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll speak from my standpoint personally. When my children were kids in this district, and I was a board member then, I was very concerned, not just for them, but for all of our children, about safe travel, especially our high school students. So we've been able to do a balance of a hybrid. We've, as a district, afforded the cost of them being able to ride COTA, especially during COVID. We offered that opportunity for them to be able to transport themselves freely on using COTA. But in addition to that, what we were doing too, I supported and voted personally to make sure that we transported our high school students because of this city. And what I mean by that, this is not an indictment. So whoever's listening, please, with all due respect, stay out of your feelings. The whole point of me making this comment is that I'll use my street. I live off of McNaughton. We had a child that was hit by 2 cars, not a bus, 2 cars, trying to make her way to a bus. on a street that does not have sidewalks. This is not a sidewalk-friendly street. Let's stay out of our feelings and be in our thoughts about how we provide those accommodations for children, communities, and families. But at the end of the day, one of the major reasons I was personally in support of making sure that children, high school kids, got transported with our buses was so they didn't have to walk to school on sidewalkless streets and neighborhoods and have to worry about being hit by a car or something else. So I just wanted to make that personal statement to say that this is why over time we've had to incur these ongoing costs because safety was paramount for many of us on the board at that time.
Thank you for that perspective, Board Member Cole. And I think that that's important, especially as we are looking at it more from the academic committee side of things. We have chosen these policies, and at the time, the policies were right for the district. But as time moves and changes, as we confront additional challenges and barriers, as our students' needs change, and we are having this, conversation around the vision of our academics and putting our students' needs first, and how do we realign our entire district, it is the right time to kind of open this back up and ensuring that, we are not only doing things that lead to the student outcomes that we are striving for, but also using our resources in the most equitable way, the most cost-efficient way for our taxpayers. And so these conversations and understanding the past on why decisions were made is incredibly, incredibly helpful. So again, this will not be the last time we hear about this. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I do have a question. Can we go back to slide 13, please? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what steps the district has taken to understand and address the driver shortage? I know you said y'all had a big thing this summer and have hired some new people, but can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
So I think the short story is that the driver shortage is a national issue that we've experienced post-pandemic. A couple of drivers, and a few of them are on this slide, is a few things. One, post-pandemic, there are just more opportunities, Uber, Amazon, et cetera, for drivers to engage in. Being a bus driver with split shifts, it can be relatively stressful, right? So there's other options for drivers to pursue. From a national perspective, across every district that I'm aware of, we're all experiencing driver shortages. So what we're doing to accommodate that specifically is, for us, we've decided to cover some of the costs/expenses for individuals who are applying to be drivers. So there's like application fees, there's tests that you have to take to become a driver. We've decided to cover some of that to increase people's interest in becoming a driver. So that's one example of what we're doing. The other example is we do have some partners that's focused on identifying and recruiting drivers. So we leverage them in their talent pools. And then there was one other point that I was going to mention, but I lost it. So I'll pause there.
What's the salary for them?
That's my other point.
Good.
Thank you. I'm channeling you. Right, so our starting salary is approximately $23, $24, right?
Okay.
But what we've seen is we have vendor partners who increased that by 50%. So we have vendor partners who offered salaries for $35 and $36, right, an hour. They still are experiencing driver shortages. So it's not necessarily a money's game. Money is important, we all get that, but it's a bigger issue that we need to take a look at.
And that doesn't include our full compensation benefit package, which is actually a lot more.
That's correct. We have a
Correct.
great benefits package, and we encourage people to continue to apply.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Woods.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to move over now to item 3.4, which is going to be our ESSER wrap-up and levy promise update. Deputy Superintendent?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. This, too, is going to be a very high-level overview. Over the last 4 years, we've provided periodic updates about our ESSER spending and ESSER progress. Very high-level overview. You can look forward to an expansive presentation that will actually be recorded and will sit on our website with lots more detail. But next slide, please. So we did receive ESSER funding in essentially 3 buckets. Of course, that funding began in the summer of 2020 and has just concluded September 30th of 2024. And I want to pause right here and thank the Treasurer's Office team, Terry, Kristen, Eric. Thank you all for all of the work and collaboration that we've had the opportunity to do together over the last 4 years related to ESSER, ensuring that our spending was aligned to the needs of our students and that we have done all the proper reporting. So I will just name that we are in, next slide, we're in the reporting phase at this time, and I'm pleased to report that as of last week, as you can see, our categories of spending, there's a very faint line up at the top that says remaining, and it is 0%.
I don't even know what
we keep losing connection here. Okay. You can see the 4 main categories of spending. And again, we'll go into additional detail on our ESSER webpage on the district website. You can click on each of those categories and it gives you a very detailed narrative and expense tied to each of those categories. Next slide. But from the beginning, we were very intentional about designing, defining, and selecting strategies that aligned to our district goals. We looked at making investments in proven high-impact areas, and we set up metrics and impact reporting all along the way. We really looked at how to leverage these dollars in a do now, build towards philosophy. We made sure that as we were standing up strategies, that we did think about how we would continue this work and study the impact, especially in making decisions about those things that we wanted to maintain. Next slide. So again, we made decisions in alignment with our board goals, especially around reading, math, and graduation. Next slide. So we had 4 priority areas. Of course, we focused on learning recovery and ensuring that we had supports for schools. We made large investments in our infrastructure, improvements in operations, technology, and professional learning. I'll pause here for just a minute and call out that it is very, very rare that federal funds are able to be used by a school district to support infrastructure improvement. Almost never. And so we had the ability, it was an allowable use of funds to make some strategic decisions about infrastructure improvement and operations. Next slide. So we did in the spring of 2021, just as we were planning for ESSER 3, we sought public comment to better understand the feedback from our community and published those results on the district website. Next slide, please. So I'm sorry, I'm going to take us back in time to the summer of 2020. And just remind you that in phase one, when there was a great deal of uncertainty, the initial ESSER funds were really focused on health and safety. We bought plexiglass, we bought masks, we bought sanitizer, and we bought a lot of Chromebooks to support instruction that, as you remember, was happening at home. As we moved into ESSER 2, was what we often call phase 2, and that's when we began to return to school in person. And as you recall, we had a hybrid model for much of that year. Groups of students came into school, but not all students were in school every day together. And so during that phase, we were really focused on strategies to support that return to in-person instruction, and those strategies to help to begin to support our students who were falling behind in terms of their instruction. And we also, at that time, made a commitment to address the ventilation in each of our school buildings. And part of that was air conditioning. And then in phase 3, we really focused on student support. So students were back in school. They were back together for the first time in almost 2 years as full classrooms. The social emotional needs of students and staff, frankly, all of us. That's when we added a school counselor in every school. We provided additional teachers for intervention, and we really began to build out our strategy around whole child supports. I will call the final one phase 4, because you remember those days when we wondered, will it ever end? And what will students need next? And will there be a next wave? And so I think part of what is incredibly important to remember in all of this is that we're a very large organization. And so being agile, making on the spot decisions can be difficult. And so we continued to monitor how we were spending and the impact that we were having. Next slide. So I won't spend a lot of time here other than to say we set up an impact reporting mechanism for every strategy, every department or school that accessed funds, it had to respond to periodic impact reports. We have them all in a large repository, and we've used them to make decisions about strategies that we want to continue. We were highlighted, next slide, as a best practice in this area for leading with impact reporting from the beginning. Next slide. So these 3 boxes here are just a sampling of strategies that we funded using our ESSER dollars over the period of ESSER 1, 2, and 3. Again, at the beginning, responding to shutdown, preparing to return, and then once we returned to in-person instruction, the additional supports that were needed in our schools. Next slide. So I'm going to jump through these and just as a teaser to let you know that we will have an expansive presentation. We'll be recording a detailed overview where you'll actually hear from a school counselor about the impact of having a school counselor in every school. Next slide. Again, HVAC upgrades. Every school building does now have air conditioning. That was not true prior to the pandemic. Next slide. We addressed security in a number of schools, security vestibules, including schools where we needed to go back in to do retrofitting for security. Next slide. We have provided cafeteria furniture in all of our middle schools. Our high schools are underway. If you have not had a chance to be in high school at lunchtime in the last year, make it a point to go. Students are really appreciating the flexible furniture, and it's made a huge difference in that lunchtime experience. Next slide.
Can I just shout you out on that? We had the opportunity to see Buckeye Middle School and really, really enjoyed and was elated at the idea of that flexible space and how it just, I think in certain ways, better accommodated the culture and climate of the school itself. It was just so informal, it was so comfortable, it was so loungy. And I'll transition that to, as we're thinking about newer spaces for administration, these are some of the accommodations that we would like to see that you saw missing in 270. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Buckeye Middle was just one of those great schools to see that space utilized that way.
Absolutely. And thank you. So again, just a reminder that it's very, very rare that federal grants can support furniture, air conditioning. We were able to put in new playgrounds across the city at a number of schools. Next slide. So again, when we have the more in-depth report, you'll be able to hear from a teacher talk about the impact of having each of her students have a Chromebook and what that opportunity to send hotspots meant to our students in the early days of the pandemic, and then how that use of technology is really changing instruction in our classrooms today.
Okay, I have a question about that. The old Chromebooks back that was purchased during this time, I've seen them piled up in libraries. What are we doing with those?
So our IT team
Yeah.
is in the process of inventorying those devices one by one to determine whether it's a device that can be refurbished. And just like in many of the capital improvements areas, that ongoing maintenance, we know that the Chromebooks that we purchased at the beginning of the pandemic are actually past their useful life and maybe can't even be receive the new updates. And so we've made a very intentional practice of working with our IT team, who will be, again, looking at every single device. You'll hear a little bit more in a minute about our need to be efficient. And for several years, every time a Chromebook was broken, we were passing out another Chromebook. And
charges were running up with students. So, and still do, as replacement cost for the student to turn in an old one, pay for a screen or pay for a plug-in. And what's going on with that?
so I'm going to ask that we have an opportunity at a later meeting
Okay.
to really talk more about that one-to-one model modification, because we spent, if you go on the website and click Chromebooks, you will see that we just cannot continue to spend in the same way for those one-to-one devices. But I think this question, especially related to the academic impact, is one I'll bring our new Chief Information Officer to the table, and we can talk more about how the one-to-one program is working now.
Well,
Let her go. Keep going, Catherine. Okay. I'd also just name here that during the pandemic, we stood up what was called the Digital Academy at that time, is now Columbus Online Academy. If you recall, it started off as a K through 12 program and is now serving students in grades 7 through 12. Next slide. We made large investments in professional learning for our staff. Again, we'll go into more detail in a later presentation on that. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So last fall, we looked very carefully at what we had funded on ESSER and had to make some very difficult decisions together with the board as to what we would be able to maintain when our ESSER dollars ended. And so this slide probably looks familiar. It was part of our statement of facts. These are the positions that were previously funded by ESSER. Many of them were needs that had existed before the pandemic. And the pandemic only exacerbated the needs for these supports. As a result of the successful passage of our levy, we were able to maintain these positions. Next slide. Similarly, we looked at the programs that were having the greatest impact, return on investment, or were going to be essential to meet the needs of students that had, again, been exacerbated by out-of-school time during the pandemic. These are the non-personnel, non-staff programs that we were able to continue and moved into the general fund. Next slide. And so as I wrap up here, I want to name that in many districts around the country, they made investments and their student outcomes are essentially flat. And in many, many cases, students have not rebounded from before COVID. The story's different here, and I'm going to show that in the next 3 slides. We are seeing improved outcomes. We are seeing students improving in progress and achievement. Next slide. So you've seen this slide before, but just want to point out that in 3rd grade, our 3rd graders exceeded the board goal. They made a 6.2 percentage gain in just the last school year, based in large part on the investments in professional development that we had made related to the science of reading in how we teach children to read. Next slide. Our graduation rate is up. In fact, we're at the highest level since before the pandemic, and that is even with the increased, more rigorous requirements for graduation. Next slide. And our students are coming to school. Our chronic absenteeism rate actually reduced by 4.9%. Next slide. And so as I wrap this up, this question about what would we say in 10 years? We aligned our strategies and resources, something we began to do very strategically, and certainly the name of this committee is a reflection of that work. And we began to, through those impact reports, really began a strategic, systematic way to look at return on investment, which is absolutely critical as we go through a resource planning process. Next. And so there was a question
several years ago about whether districts needed these resources. Our district, our students absolutely had needs before the pandemic. The pandemic exacerbated those needs. I believe that we have fully answered the question. Yes, our students needed resources. Our community needed resources. We aligned investments to our priorities, and as you saw in those last 3 slides, student outcomes improved. So if you click on the link, it takes you to the district webpage. Again, very detailed reporting there. You can see impact reports and a number of reports that were done over the last 4 years. But again, thank you for the opportunity to provide a high-level overview related to ESSER.
Thank you. Do you want to quickly do, because you kind of started in on the levy stuff, to just do that, and then we can ask you questions?
Yes, absolutely. So if we could have the 2 levy promise slides. You have to close out of this one. Thank you. And I'm actually going to ask Treasurer Cook to take these 2.
Let's go to the next slide. So I think the headline really says it all there. Promises made and promises kept. And you've heard me talk through the 5-year forecast about some of the increases we've had with staffing, 495 hires this year. The issue itself was approximately 100 million, 38, almost 40, let's say 40 million of that was for staffing, et cetera. 60% was for capital improvements. You've heard a lot of highlights tonight about investments we've made in personnel, transportation, et cetera. That's a direct correlation, not only with just the ESSER funds, but with issue 11 that passed. We've done exactly what we said we were going to do with these funds. We continue to invest in those. My office is working on ways we can track that moving forward so that the board can see these strategic investments that have been made with those levy funds. Again, I think the highlight is promises made, promises kept. Although I wasn't here for that, I can verify and vouch for the fact that we've made those investments and then some with respects to personnel. So we're doing exactly what we said we would do with those funds.
So we actually have already created a webpage, and we will make periodic updates to that page. So similar to what we learned from the ESSER website, one could click on the link and get detailed information about both the operating expenses and then the permanent improvement projects as those move forward.
Okay, I'm sorry. What you're referring to is what Ryan is saying.
There's going to be updates on the website that are updated with the investments we're making and have made.
Okay, so when you're saying that your team is working on being able to track, that's what you're referring to? How you're tracking?
Yes.
This slide here, this slide is just a screenshot of the webpage that will be built out similar to the way we build out the ESSER webpage. So again, if you're interested in tracking how the district has spent the general operating fund expenses related to the levy, you'd be able to click on the link and it would take you to all of the strategies and what they cost,
Do you
what we
have
spent.
like an estimated completion date?
I don't have an estimated completion date yet. I know we're actively working on it. Our general fund is, I'm going to say, one big pot of money, if you will. So as this revenue comes in, we're trying to segment that out so that we can help answer the academic side, what they've done with the investments, capital improvement, academic, and then personnel, and put them on this website so that we can segment out those specific levy expenditures.
Yeah, I understand what you're going to do. I just wondered if you had an estimated time of completion.
I don't. It's not an easy project.
Okay.
Thank you. Additional questions? Okay, thank you. All right, we'll stay with Treasurer Cook and talk about our new cash balance policy.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully you have a copy of this. If not, I was going to run some copies before I came down, but our internet prevented me from printing when it crashed. So I'm going to take a minute and read the policy to you if you don't have it in front of you. The board believes that maintaining a cash reserve, unencumbered, unreserved balance of 90 days of operating expenditures is necessary in the interest of sound fiscal management. The board affirms that tax levies shall be pursued and/or the district finances otherwise managed to ensure a general operating fund unencumbered reserve cash balance equivalent to at least 90 days of operating expenditures. Upon receiving any indication that such a cash balance may not be achieved within the first 3 years of the rolling 5-year financial forecast period, the treasurer shall report such a finding to the board. Upon such notification by the treasurer CFO, the superintendent CEO, and treasurer CFO will prepare and propose options that the board may consider to forestall such an eventuality. Further, the board believes that the financial goals of the district should be in alignment with the district's strategic plan and instructional goals. When a general operating fund cash balance exceeds 150 days, the superintendent may prepare a plan for the expenditure of the excess general operating cash balance on one or more of the deliverables of the strategic plan. This plan must be approved by the Board of Education and cannot result in the general operating fund cash balance falling below 90 days in any year of the rolling 5-year forecast. So to build some context around that, when I presented the 5-year forecast, I spent a lot of time in this committee and at our board meeting talking about the importance of sustainability. Think of it like your savings account at home. We talked about transportation costs escalating tonight. We've talked about the educational costs moving forward, our facility needs, and I haven't heard anybody mention any of these costs are decreasing. As we progress through that forecast, our expenses exceed revenue in each of the 5 years. So we're beginning to whittle away at that savings account. We're okay the first couple years of that forecast, but the last 3 years of the forecast that we have now, and I'm asking the board to approve at our next meeting, fall below that threshold. So again, for the fiscal stability and health of the district, it's a great guardrail to have for sustainability as we move forward. It's a very well-designed policy in that we have a minimum and a maximum. We're not a bank. We're not here to just build up endless amounts of taxpayer resources to sit on. So there's an off-ramp that provides the superintendent, when we hit thresholds above a certain point, to invest those dollars back into the classroom as long as they align with the strategic plan. So again, as we talk about academic goals and guardrails, this is an excellent shot at a fiscal guardrail to help us be sustainable operationally, academically, and fiscally as we move forward as a district. So that's my proposal for the committee.
Thank you. I did just try to send it to the guys in the back. If they could put it up on the screen.
Did it work?
I just did it.
Okay.
So, because I do believe like we need to have it on paper for people to read, to look at it. So, are there any questions about the need for it or what the treasurer is proposing? Mr. Cole.
Thank you. Mr. Cook, Treasurer, do you feel as though this policy gives you every bit of flexibility to, have the autonomy that you need to have in this space?
I do. I think it gives me the flexibility. I think it also gives the superintendent the confidence and flexibility that, again, we're not just going to stockpile cash reserves as we move forward. There's a plan to make sure we can continue to provide that level that we have now, as well as a maximum so she can invest or he can invest moving forward. But yes, I'm comfortable with the policy.
Go ahead.
Why 90 days instead of 60 or 30 or the other?
So I think it's a starting point. I figured we would have some pretty healthy conversation around that metric. In my presentations, I've always shown a 60-day metric. I think 30 is out there. I'm comfortable with 60. What I'm very uncomfortable with is 30. I don't think it gives many districts much of the ability to be agile and nimble and plan, because again, it's not like you just come in one day and say, oh, we're below it. It's very thoughtful, it's very methodical, and it takes time. We've heard about that tonight in several other areas. We're just not going to be able to move that fast. 60 is what I present. I'm extremely comfortable with that. I'm not married to 90. Obviously, as a treasurer, I would take 150 if you give it to me. But I think we have to be reasonable. There's a lot of data. I have a copy of a white paper here from OASBO that's done a lot of work and a lot of studies around this. GFOA has done that as well. I can live with 60. I think that gives us time to plan. Again, it's 3 years out. Hopefully, in that point of time, as leaders administratively in the district, we can have those conversations. Because again, every dollar we do impacts the classroom, drafts up as well. So I'm comfortable with 60. 90 would be great. But I think 60 does the job for us and allows that flexibility and confidence in the policy, as Board Member Cole asked.
Board Member Cole.
In my tenure, we've gone through, we've had the opportunity to work with 3 treasurers. The first one, Penny, she was down to the less than 0.1% in terms of the money. I've watched this evolve from balancing to 0 to 30 and now to 60, and how we're thinking about this moving forward. Again, I'll second what his comments were. The reason that we really want to think about the best practices we possibly can employ is so that we continue to maintain sustainability, so that we continue to look not just out 5 years, but even further, and then show solvency, demonstrate solvency in the process. I think that's a due diligence not only to the organization in itself, but also to Joe and Jane taxpayer, you and I even, who are sitting at the table as that. So that's why I second that idea.
Yeah, I would be uncomfortable if I came in at 60 and went to 30. I just don't think we have the breathing room to be effective and make good, strong strategic decisions. 60, more than comfortable with.
I had a question about the new state mandates for the science of reading. And any public district, are we expecting any monies from the state for this additional cost of?
That's a super great question, but I'd like to keep us right here on this cash balance policy. So really what this committee is being asked to do is kind of think about it in terms of a best practice, and looking and hearing what the treasurer is saying. Do we think that this is something that is of benefit to our district in terms of having it written down? We actually are kind of doing this at a 60-day, but having this as something that is written down. If we think that that is a good best practice, we like the number 60, or we just like a cash balance policy in general, what we would do is then actually shift this over to the policy committee, who would then be taking a more technical review of it, and going through that process. So Treasurer Cook is bringing this to us as more of a subject matter. Do we think that this is something that is a best practice that we should adopt in writing?
And I just want to note, we don't have this sort of a policy right now. There's no trigger point for those conversations between the superintendent and the treasurer to occur to address even some of the structural issues we have in our present forecast.
Mr. Cook, did you get other internal feedback on this? Any comments or anything from the superintendent's office regarding the number of days?
I didn't ask them. I strictly looked at this through our lens, the research that's been done, working with my team. So, no.
Okay.
So the 90-day forecast is something that we haven't, Columbus City hasn't.
We presently do not have a cash balance policy that has any trigger points on the low end or high end at all. This would be my understanding the first time.
Had good treasurers.
There you go.
So this puts, again, in writing, kind of practices that we have, as Board Member Cole said, kind of come to and started using. And again, our treasurer saying that this is really a best practice, that we should have this written down.
Yeah, it really gives us some teeth, not just for myself, but the superintendent. It forces us to act as we begin to see cautionary events unfold in that forecast.
Where did the 90 days in the policy come from? Is that coming from the draft, I assume from Neola? How did 90 get into this?
No, there's multiple out there. Some districts have more, some have less. We
Oh,
just
okay.
picked one, put it in.
picked
I've
one.
always
Okay.
presented, as I said, I was comfortable with 60, but what I didn't want to do was come in at 60, we end up at 30, because I just don't think 30 is effective. We don't have enough time to react at that point.
Okay.
What's the actual, like, I guess, practice of it? So in terms of like working with the superintendent between like, 90 versus a 60-day, like what's the practical impact of switching the days, like the trigger, I guess?
Yeah, all it's going to do is that trigger point on the forecast, like the third year of this forecast, we're below 60 days anyways. So it would force me now to begin those conversations with Dr. Chapman to say, hey, we have a board policy. We need to sit down and begin to look at a plan. That could be reducing expenses, increasing revenue, et cetera. And again, then we present those to the Board of Education to potentially act on. It doesn't mean you have to adopt any of those plans, but again, it really forces those conversations to move forward. Whereas right now, there's really nothing that forces us to get to the table, not that we wouldn't, but again, it's always nice to have policy as a good, solid guardrail moving forward.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Is this something typically, like I understand it's definitely a finance policy, but is this something typically, because this is like a kind of a different relationship, maybe your process with the superintendent's office, that you have,
I've seen a lot of cash balance policies that don't include that.
Okay.
They just have a number. To me, the number without, there's no context to that number without a plan. Again, I think that's where I don't want to be able to act unilaterally, if that makes sense. I think that's where it kind of forms that partnership. It says, hey, we've identified a challenge on the horizon. We both need to collectively sit down and look at where we're at versus me just saying, hey, board, here's a problem and a solution. Because again, I'm not the academic expert. I don't have a way to quantify that. I can look at certainly what those numbers are, but then I think we need to come together to work as a cohesive unit based on this policy so that, again, we can hopefully be sustainable.
so the treasurer is actually proposing that we make a recommendation on this, and it wouldn't go to the board yet. Like I said, it would go over to the policy committee. I
I'll
don't know
defer
if
to
we
you.
have
I
enough.
think we're sending it to the board.
Oh, we are?
Are you
want-
comfortable with that as policy chair?
I think-
This isn't one you don't think that no? Okay. For technical? No? Okay. So it would go right to the board then?
I'm okay with that.
The chair of our policy committee says yes. We're tweaking that too, like what goes over there and what goes, okay.
Yeah, for full transparency, we are adjusting what should be going to the Policy and Governance Committee and how we can best use the community input that the committee structures are set up to support. And so if the answer is a debate between 60 and 90, that would be appropriate for the board table. That's what we're debating. If we're debating stuff like what we will be considering on our December 9th meeting of how should we structure task forces that look at building closures and how can we best set that up for success, I think that type of work would be really appropriate in a community committee. And so that's part of why I'm looking at Jen and saying,
Yeah.
this one will go straight
I
to
feel
the
very
board.
comfortable having that discussion at the board
Yeah,
level.
so that we're using our committees most effectively.
Okay, so then the question becomes, does this committee right now feel like you have enough information to go ahead and send this to the board as a recommendation, based on the treasurer's recommendation as a best practice, and allow the board to then, as Sarah said, consider this on the floor and debate about what's the technical language is? That would be what this committee would be doing as a best practice fiscal policy. Do you feel like you have enough to
Yeah,
do
I
that?
do.
You do?
Yes.
Okay. Is there then a motion to recommend that the Board of Education review the new cash balance policy? And we are sending it up through as a recommendation that this would be a good fiscal best practice policy to add. Is there a motion?
I make the motion.
Second.
There's a second. Any other discussion? Please call the roll.
Lear,
Yes.
Mr. Cole,
Yes.
Ms. Engel,
Yes.
Ms. Price,
Yes.
Do you want this?
Ms. Upchurch?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and our last item, we are going to hear from, I think, Chief of Staff and Deputy Superintendent about the establishment of a resource planning committee, a planning team, I'm sorry. I will need a quick motion to untable this, that we tabled it at our last meeting. Can I have a motion to untable this item?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Dare?
Ms. Adair?
Yes.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Ms. Ingles?
Yes.
Ms. Price?
Yes.
Ms. Upchurch?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi, everyone, again. I promise we'll be brief. We're actually going to be coming back in front of you a few times this year. So this is really just an introduction to the work. This committee is called the Equitable and Transparent Resource Management Committee. That is aligned directly to our board guardrail, which is aligning resources equitably. And so the work that you're going to hear about tonight is the establishment of a team to support exactly what we're talking about right now. We have several processes in the district that actually should all be aligned and feed into how schools are funded, how we allocate our resources, and how we meet student need. And so we are going to have our team come up and talk to you about how they're going to be supporting those processes. The deliverable for this year for this work is a transparent visual of what our resource planning process is across the district. This is a big deal for us, just an FYI. I've been here 6 years and I've not seen anything that actually is cross-departmental and pulls together the budget, the enrollment, the staffing, all of it. So this is the first step in making sure that's transparent. The reason why we are so focused on this is our principals should be able to have very clear and productive conversations with their communities about what are the needs of my students and how is my school resourced. We should also be able to create a space where we're meeting with the community at large in budget roundtables and other formats to hear what are the main areas that are important to the community and how are we funding them and how are we resourcing them. So all of this work is in support of that aim, again, in support of the board guardrail around aligning resources equitably, and ultimately the whole point of this committee. So it is very on the nose. So I'm going to introduce to you our first speaker tonight, but Ann Palcisco is our Director of Quality Assurance. She works for me in the superintendent's office. Ann's job is to look across the system at processes and systems and kind of dive into what needs a little bit of love. And so she's been doing this work for a little over a year now with us. Ann, do you want to come up? Ann is one of our resource planning team members. The other members here, I just want to note, Hem and Mike, all three of these folks are former teachers. They, not only one of them from our school district, Mike, we stole him, but all three of these folks have been in the classroom and have a good understanding of what it means to work in a school. We also have someone from the finance team who's not with us tonight, but is also part of
I'm going to flip my budget team your way instead of Jordan. I've got a lot of projects.
Okay, got it. One from the budget team will be on the team. Ann, you want to take us away?
Real time.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. I'm excited today just to tell you all a little bit about the work we've been doing so far this year. I'd like to introduce first fellow members. So we have Hem Reisel, he is the Manager of Data and Analytics in our Strategy and Performance space, and Mike Barnes, who is the Manager of Data and Analytics in our HR space. So as Mike's, if we can go next slide, please. as Mike said, we just want to always be grounding this work in our board goals and guardrails around aligning resources equitably. This is our North Star in this work. We are just trying to help folks do this across the district. Next slide, please. So as we prepare for this work, really we wanted to start to think about our vision for what this should be in the district. Especially as we move off ESSER, how we align resources to strategy becomes particularly important. When we talk about district budgeting and school planning processes, our goals include these 5 things. So first off is just cohesive and integrated. We want decision makers to be able to consider the full set of their resources at the time that they are making decisions. Currently in our system, they get bits of information at different times, but have to make decisions before they get key information later. So really trying to narrow down that timeline, getting people together. Another thing is that it needs to be more collaborative. And along with that is grounding us in our district priorities and goals. We're also really focused on standardizing and making this process a lot more transparent so that not only do people know what they're going to get, but they know why they got it and they know when they're going to get it. And those are big steps forward for us, especially at the school level. And lastly, we're really focused on making sure that our investments are sustainable so that we're not investing a lot and then realizing later on that we can't keep that going, especially if we're seeing good returns of investment on that. I'm going to hand it over now to Mike to talk us through the next slide, please.
Thank you for everybody's time tonight. I know it's getting late, but we want to talk a little about why we're doing this, right? So I won't read this whole slide to you, but these entail some of the things that we got some feedback from school principals last year and some other work that we did around finance and budgets that they felt were not happening. The partner that helped us with that, the survey, those questions came out of actual research that academic institutions that do these things well, actually there's a correlation to improved student outcomes. So there's evidence out there that this work, aligning these resources, being thoughtful and purposeful about how we do it across the entire organization, does actually lead to improved student outcomes. If we can go to the next slide. So this is the vision for what we want to produce, right? So we want to start at the top with district priorities, as Ann mentioned. Leadership is going to allocate that money to be used towards student outcomes. But we want to have a plan and have the departments aligned to those same goals and guardrails. And we want that to then be transferred down to the schools, right? If a principal can't explain to parents why the school has the resources it has or doesn't have the resources that they're asking about, then kind of this whole process has failed, right? If that doesn't get translated all the way down to the school and classroom level, then what we've spent money on is not then actually being used the way that it was intended from the leadership, from the board to the superintendent to the department on down. And so our goal is to have a process that goes across this entire spectrum and is aligned from top to bottom. So what's going on in classrooms is aligned with the vision of the board and the superintendent. And then we're going to turn it over to Hem for the next slide.
Thank you, everyone. What does it mean for what we do this year and what we're going to do in the future years, right? We have 4 tasks that we've been charged with. Number 1 of this is that we want to be able to document the transparent timeline of resource planning that we're currently on versus what improvements we might be willing to make over time, right? So develop that timeline that is cross-departmental so that where departments are not working in silos, we're actually collaborating with each other. Number 2, we want to be able to document all of the resources that schools get and be able to have them all in one place so schools and leaders can look at that and know exactly what resources are available for them all so they know what resources they have and the rationales for why they have them. We also want to be able to provide guardrails and guidelines and templates for folks to look at as they're planning in this process and also be able to support them as they're doing their planning, right? And we also want to be able to support decision makers and leaders in the district as they make these decisions that are sometimes really difficult. Last, this is really, really important. We also want to be able to document their feedback, the feedback from you all, our school leaders, district leaders, our community members, so that way we're documenting these feedbacks, so that way we can continuously kind of iterate on this process and improve it moving forward. With that, what questions do you all have?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Ms. Price.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was saying questions, and you have one, so go right ahead.
All right. My question would be, okay, so we have schools getting resources. Are the teachers developing teacher-based teams to also have some input on these resources in the building? Or is it the principal saying we need these resources? Or are you using data from the ODE website to get these resources? Is it a disbursement of resources, or are we developing, is the school developing a plan of their own for their clients and their students? Anybody?
So I think part of our work is to find out how that is happening at the school level. Our focus this year really is on trying to understand what are current practices, and based on that, then trying to help identify places where we can make key changes to make it better. I'm gonna guess right now it's probably building by building, depending on the experience of the leader, the community that's involved. But we haven't gotten down to that point in our research yet, but it is on our list of things to look at.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you. Treasurer Cook, can you talk a little bit about AlaView?
So I think transparent documentation, again, one system that we can use. We presently use AlaView for our budgeting, and we can do that by OPU, by building. Principals have access to this. We've had some conversations in my office about offering more training. Again, I know there's turnover as people come into a system, leave a system, but that's a very transparent resource that they know exactly what the resources are. My office does this at a higher level. It sounds like to me they're going to take this macro level figure that they get and then look more at a micro level, building by building, to try to make sense of all these different individual operating units within this larger one. But AlaView, at least from a data and a budgeting and a process tool, is our repository for all of that. I can't speak to necessarily the equity piece of that. That's more this side of the house to do. But AlaView is that key driver as well. And again, I'll talk just briefly about timelines. I have a schedule of our high-level macro budget timelines that we have to have for 5-year forecasting, appropriations, et cetera. There's just some legal timelines we have to have. But then on a micro level, I think these conversations are important down at the building level to have happen. But AlaView, to Board Member Cole's point, is just a marvelous tool. I had not seen it prior to getting here. It's a tool I wished I had. I can almost guarantee you most of the administrative team that I've worked with previously would have just loved that resource at their fingertips.
Board Member Cole?
Thank you again. I really greatly appreciate your comment about building leadership, level of experience, understanding of the process. Because to answer your question, I think what's critical on a building for building basis, whether, and AlaView helps tremendously, but I think it's important that the building level leader and that of the principal and the APs have the ability to continue to work with their TBTs, continue to work with their leadership building teams, in a way that continues to keep them informed and engaged about what the priorities really are on a building for building level. So if teachers are saying that we want a particular type of software to be able to use or access, they have the ability to have that conversation and subsequently prioritize it in the process. So thank you for that, because that's where all that magic really happens.
And I think to piggyback on that point, AlaView is a key tool for me. We're going to begin academic ROI as we move forward. If I could have an ask of you guys, it's important that our building leadership really hone in on that tool so that they can understand where the allocation we give at the top is going and then begin to tie it into that academic ROI. So we've got the tool, we just need the buy-in and the utilization to really drive that knowledge forward so that our teachers do have the resources they need.
We've started playing with that ourselves, downloading data out of it.
Awesome.
Comparing that to Munis, which has been our tool.
Yep.
Awesome.
Previously, so that we can, with some confidence, help building leaders and department leaders use that tool and socialize it, so.
We're speaking the same
just
language.
beginning to,
Yeah,
but we
yeah.
have started digging into that.
I appreciate that, thank you.
Yeah, so this is, I'm really excited what I'm hearing, to be honest with you. I think it's at multiple levels, and I think that's what this conversation is like kind of alluding to right now. So the board goal, and the guardrail the board has set is, right, is a system view of equity, right? And as this conversation is going, we know that it ends up in the school, right? And so, my question is, and I know that you, Mr. DeFabo, you came up and said, you know, the deliverable this year is this, right? And that's really what the board at the high level is going to be making sure that you are doing, right, to, as a guardrail, the superintendent is supposed to be working on. So can you just say that one more time? Like, what is the deliverable that the board should be expecting this year around this guardrail of aligning resources equitably? And then while you're up here as well, I think the treasurer makes a good point, because we kind of have things going on in both offices, and I want to make sure too that we're aligning our resources.
Right.
Being, you know, the most efficient with all of our resources.
Yes.
And we're working together, so.
Yep.
Yeah, so to your first question, the deliverable that this team has heard me talk about over and over and over again is that at the end of this year, we will have a visual that explains how we move across the organization to allocate resources. And that will include the alignment of multiple departments and inputs from multiple departments. As an example, enrollment projections sit in one space. Budget and budget timelines sit in another space. How we staff and what staff is allocated sits in a whole different space. So we have multiple pieces of this puzzle, and it is critical for us to make it clear that these pieces are aligned, because we cannot work in silos here. And so we have to make sure that if we see an enrollment projection increase because there is a new development coming to an area, that goes into how we budget and resource for that school, and that goes into how we staff that school. And so we are one system, and we should be looking at this across the whole system. Ultimately, though, this is about how we make transparent to our school communities and to the community at large how we allocate resources, and that is tied to student need. And so the long-term goal here, talk a little long-term goal, I promise I won't commit you guys to anything yet. But any of us should be able to go to our website or to another space with resources, and it should be very clear how a school is resourced. We should be able to look up a school name, and it tells us exactly all of those things that I just talked about for that school specifically. And then we would roll that up into potentially regional or grade band or district spaces. And that becomes how we go out and advocate and how we tell our story about student need.
Right.
And so this is all about how we pull back the curtains and really expose to everyone what it means to resource a school correctly and resource schools tied to student need.
And that tool will be Allaview?
It is Allaview.
That
Okay,
tool
I'm
will
just
be Allaview.
Making sure, because
Yes.
you're already invested over here.
So,
Okay,
And it will do those pieces. That's the beauty of this.
okay.
It's not there yet, though.
Right, okay, right.
So it doesn't do
We're
that
building,
today.
We're building.
But it will be there eventually, and we're working with ERS, who we worked with in the past. ERS has used Allaview in other school districts successfully. We've seen demos of it, so we know its capabilities, and we know what it can do. And so we will get there.
You know what, we'll bring in, the finance committee from last year saw all of you. You guys haven't seen it, so we'll let you see it.
Yeah.
We'll bring it
Terry's
in.
grinning.
Terry's gonna love it.
It's a great idea.
It's gonna be- It actually is a really cool tool. so
It is,
our
it
committee
is
can
a very
actually see it.
informative tool.
There's one other thing I was hoping to highlight with these three folks behind me, if that's okay. The district made investments into our data spaces to ensure that we were creating space and bringing in folks who are very data-minded and developing folks who are currently here into data experts. And so the three people behind me are examples, actually, of this work. Ann was an internal employee and became a internal Harvard Data Fellow for the Strategic Data Project. Hem was coming to us as an external fellow with the Harvard Data Project. And Mike was a teacher in the district and came to us externally, sort of, in the same way as an internal Harvard Data Fellow. So all three of these folks actually went through the Strategic Data Project. They presented projects at the end of that to a national audience. And our ability to pull them cross-functionally to work on a project like this is an excellent example of how we are breaking down silos. Awesome. So I applaud them, and I just want to thank the board because that was a very strategic investment, and we want to continue to lean into that space so that we can have data-informed decision-making.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you all
Awesome.
so much.
Awesome.
I'll
come to you for Excel.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This, was a jam-packed meeting. We talked a lot about all the things that make, we're working on around equity and resourcing and budgets, and we touched on our task force recommendations tonight. So thank you for your time. The last thing we need is just a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second?
Second.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you.